Yeah, we're live.
All live? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to AMA number 37, the 4th of May, a month since our last AMA. Introducing Art Brock, co-founder, Mary Camacho, executive director, and myself, David Atkinson, commercial director. A few announcements. So for those of you who want to know sort of the official events, if you search for or load holo.host/events, you can see that we've got an online Holochain meetup in Cape Town on the 5th of May, so coming up tomorrow. The demo, another online demo for the Holochain wiki on the 6th of May. An online Holochain meetup in New York City on the 7th of May, or for the New York City area, obviously. In Seoul, South Korea, an online Holochain meetup in the 9th of May. And then we've also have a few people, Grace, Hidayat and Guillaume, various members of organization and community, presenting together at the Open 2020 webinar on May the 21st. And a quick other sort of event announcement shout out, if you go to forum.holochain.org/events or search for that in your browser, you can also look at some of the community events. For example, we have a virtual hackalong running at the moment. So a couple of different places to look for events. I don't think there are any other announcements, so I think we'll go straight into answering the questions now. So let's see, there's sort of normal 25 questions or so. So we'll see how we go through this month. So actually, a contextual question here. So Mary, can you tell us, how does a typical working day look like? And has anything changed because of the quarantine?
Yeah, it's interesting. In a lot of ways, we're working very similarly to how we were before, but with a few exceptions. Back in February, we had some travel scheduled, but we saw what this might mean for a few people who were afraid of getting stuck in different parts of the world. And so we canceled some travel basically for our product dev team. They were all planning to meet in the UK in March for an intensive get together. And I think a bunch of you probably saw some of the community events that we canceled or moved or changed up. And a lot of those, as David has just said, have gone online. So, but I think for a lot of us, our experiences are similar to the rest of the world, really. I mean, some have been more in like more harsh lockdowns than others, like in Spain. But really, we've just been working, and we were working from home before, and we're continuing to work remotely today. But really, I'd say the coronavirus and COVID-19, it's been tough on our team, and I'm sure it's been tough on a lot of people. But we've had family of team members affected, and the trauma's been hard. We're doing what we can to support people, but at a distance, that's not always easy. Some folks on our team have stepped away. They're working on projects directly related to the pandemic relief efforts. And I'm sure we'll have more to share about those sorts of things in the future. But right now, we're just heads down, doing the work. And yeah, that's what it looks like here.
Super, thank you, Mary. So on to delivery timeframes. I'm just wondering, as probably many others are, is there a rough time frame for when we'll be able to test our ports with open alpha, e.g. 1 month, 2 months? A couple of follow-on questions. So when will the HoloPort admin panel open? We've been waiting since January. And nearly halfway through the second quarter, would you say you guys are right on schedule for a beta release before the end of the year? So sort of batched questions there.
Yeah, I think these are a bunch of different questions that got all put together into one because it's probably easier to answer that way. Yes, we are. I'd say that we are on schedule and for a beta release this year. And we've really been making a lot of great progress for end-to-end hosting, even in these strange times. Specifically, we've been going through several rounds of testing that have us take the sort of integrated or end-to-end experience we go into an internal QA testing where our team is doing the work, and we're doing automated testing and manual testing, and that's before we deploy it into what we call our field test environment. And that's where we're set up with a small group of Holochain app developers and a few other community members that have been doing real user testing in there. We're also working this week to expand that group into what we call our pre-release testers. This is a group of volunteer hosts that have gone through a process with our team, and they're going to be starting up this week, and I think this week actually. I didn't actually validate that piece earlier, but we've been talking to them, getting them prepped to support us in that environment. And up until now, what we've been testing is the host experience of the HP admin as well as HoloFuel. And if you're on Telegram or in the forum, you're seeing nearly daily updates right now about what's going on in dev. And so what we're doing right now is working to get it to the next round. This past week, we were working specifically on a get links issue that we discovered in the HoloFuel DNA. That one looks to be resolved, but we're also enhancing the ability for the app, the HoloFuel DNA, to know when it's disconnecting from the conductor, so that users are getting more clear errors. For instance, if the connectivity, their local connectivity, goes down or isn't constant. Also, the Holochain team has really learned a lot from these test cycles. That's been super important for us. It's really the first intense test of Holochain with HoloFuel that we've been doing, and it's allowed us to run a successful test on our testing rig, for example, with 500 HoloFuel nodes working, which is that's been steadily going up as we've resolved issues that we're finding during the test, which is exactly how it's supposed to work. And a lot of it, this last one, when we made the leap to 500 nodes, that was because of some changes that we made where the nodes are now looking for data that the host is the author of. So for instance, if I'm doing a transaction, I should know that I'm the author of that transaction so I can look to myself. And that speeds up, it gives us efficiency. And so that's one of the ways that we've been able to bump these numbers up in our tests. In this, we're doing another round right now of testing. So we're hopefully this week, we're going to be getting it into an integrated QA. So that means we are going to be doing the testing early in the week. And then our plan is to get that into our field test again later this week. So in some other news though, we've just completed some work on the USB reset for HoloPorts. So this is one of the things we really need to avoid during the larger alpha test, is that we don't want our HoloPorts to get into a state that they can't get out of. That's really important because, normally when you're testing it in an alpha test, you control all of the hardware, you control the environments, you need to go change something, you do it. Well, with this, all of the HoloPorts are distributed around. So if something goes wrong, it's a lot more difficult to make sure that they can get reset. So one of the ways that we have to do this, it's not the end all be all replace everything, but what it does is it does a reset to the source chain on HoloPort. And so what we're getting ready to do is put that out in such a way that not just the people with monitors and keyboards can do this, but also people who don't have that and just have the USB that's in the back of their HoloPort. So we're getting ready to take that out into our field test this week and get that tested and get it out to, hopefully, to the wider environment. And it may actually support some of those folks who were having difficulties getting their HoloPort connected to the network in the first place.
Super, thank you, Mary.
Okay.
So Art, in your last Medium article, you talked about people getting reports on the health of an organization in new ways. And you described it in terms of a visualization of an underwater ecosystem. Can you tie that possibility together with Holochain? Is it Holochain apps that could be designed to gather and display the kind of data you were talking about? Would the scene be visible to just the participants of an app, or could it be public? How would people know what it meant? And how could people trust the data? Or moreover, how could they trust the app developers knew how to identify the good in an ecosystem pattern. And just before you jump in, I think, could you just remind us what the article was, and someone, could you please post the link so people listening get a chance?
Yeah, the article was one of the ones in my sort of NextNet unenclosable carriers series. There's a whole series of these articles, which I ended up having to break actually into multiple parts, started breaking into 3 parts, and even had to break one of those parts into 4 parts. So I think there's six parts. Anyway, the thing that we're talking about here is something that we call holoptonets. This is a made-up word, but it's basically about networks of data flows where any node in that network can see patterns of the whole, right? And so I sometimes use the image of like the aquarium screensaver, for those of you that are familiar with that, as an example of kind of the seeing engine or visualization framework that it would be possible to compress essentially millions of simultaneous data points and patterns into, and our perceptual system can actually take that all in kind of in a glance. Kind of, you can absorb the gestalt of what's happening. If you see, you know, different species of fish in different quantities swimming at different speeds or at different levels, and, you know, the cloudiness of the water and the how many bubbles are rising, and that, like, you can configure lots of different variables, and we have the ability to take in that data all at once in a way that somebody who, for example, might be the CEO of a multinational organization who gets a 400-page printout report plopped on his desk where he is like trying to read about the you know, everything going on in the organization. That's a form of data that we cannot process quickly, right? And if he or she is lucky, there are graphs and charts that help summarize some of the numbers and things like that, but often even those things take a lot of interpretation, and so being able to have data, like our perceptual system is designed for these immersive natural environments. And when you can translate data into that kind of format, then suddenly people can see larger patterns in the whole much more quickly. And that's what we're talking about here. And this was a conversation that actually came out of Scepter, the kind of predecessor project to Holochain that we prototyped a lot of things in, and it was designed with the semantics and self-describing protocols to make something like this easy. Holochain is just a partial step in that direction. The DHT in Holochain is how the parts can see the state of the whole, but we've tried to limit how steep the learning curve is in Holochain, so it doesn't quite have like all the same semantics and universal pluggable protocols and that kind of stuff. Instead, we've just tried to connect it with kind of widely accepted existing standards like JSON, message pack, that kind of thing, so that Holochain can connect with existing systems and data, but it doesn't have kind of the universal pluggable semantics of the data in the way that Scepter's designed to. So it'd be much harder to run something like this on it. As far as some of the other questions, as far as how public it is, that would be a function of who makes it and what kind of permissions they set up, what kind of access they set up, and who they're trying to serve. And then the question of how can you trust the data? Well, I would ask, how can you ever trust data? Holochain provides a huge upgrade from normal data because all data is immutable and digitally signed as far as where it came from. So that's a huge upgrade right now. On most data, it just sits there as if it's natively true, but it isn't, right? It all came from somewhere, and if you hide where it came from, then it makes it that much harder to determine how to trust it. So in summary, TLDR, Holochain's a step in that direction, but it's not designed to run like full-blown holoptonets out of the box.
All right, super, thanks, Art. All right, so I've seen a bunch of voting app discussions on the Holochain forum. I've got a bit of an echo here. With a variety of use cases or requirements. Have you had any NGOs or non-government organizations or municipalities chat with you about the possibility of using Holochain for governance? Is this area something you are pursuing partnerships and projects for? So Mary, I think
Well,
something.
yeah, I just have a
Sarah?
quick thing on this. We were approached by someone and we've actually put in a joint application to the European Union's Horizon 2020 grant fund with a project very much in this area. It's not focused specifically or simply, I guess, on voting, but it's also about all the decision making as a, making better decisions as a whole. We think these kinds of issues are a little bit more deeper than just the vote, and it would be a lot better if the proposals could be developed through more collaboration and better coordination. And then maybe we wouldn't have to be choosing two things that we don't want when something's put up for an election. So anyway, I think, David, you probably have more to say about this.
Yeah, I think I want to chime in. So yeah, we've had lots of conversations with major institutions and communities, all sorts of organizations in this area, ranging from what we do at the human and community level through to the institutional level. And right now, just really clearly, like, we are building relationships, and in those relationships, highlighting new patterns and possibilities for collaboration, but we're not focused on building those solutions out right now. Art, I think I should just say, so for those of you who like more information about these kind of partnership-y or adoption questions, there's a few members in different communities you can find on Telegram or on the forum that organize sort of more closed phone calls with members of the team where we talk through we talk through solutions and opportunities in more depth. So please come and join those calls. And Art, something here you'd like to chime in with?
Yeah, just it's interesting because there's a project that's been created where there's the HWiki, the Holochain based wiki that is actually set up to be able to be kind of a sidechain wiki app for DAOs on Ethereum and that kind of thing. And now they are doing most of the voting using tokens on DAO Stack or on Ethereum and that kind of thing. And yet, because it's so expensive to store data and have the discussions and interaction and that kind of stuff in those mediums, but they still want to make cryptographically signed connections between things, that's HWiki was designed to be able to be kind of an interface between these sort of things. And one of the things we're looking at, fairly soon, once we get the Holo hosting framework up, is ways of providing Holo hosted apps as side chains for blockchain apps and that kind of thing, which takes a portion of this away and connects it in with a place that people are already doing some of this voting framework stuff.
Okay, super, thank you. All right, Art, another one for you. Going back to basics, can you explain the role of HoloFuel in Holochain and how this is different from other tokens on Holochain?
Yeah, well, first of all, as you probably know, Holochain doesn't have a built-in token, unlike most blockchains, which basically have to build in tokens because they're so inefficient to run that most end users can't realistically run it on the devices that they use on a daily basis, like phones, tablets, or laptops. So you have to pay a special class of users, like miners or stakers, for using a lot of their computing power, right? Holochain doesn't have that problem, so we don't have built-in currencies. So HoloFuel doesn't have some special status in Holochain in terms of, being a king currency or something like that. You can build currencies on Holochain, and HoloFuel is an example of a currency built on Holochain. While Holochain doesn't have this problem of sort of this imbalanced load, Holo does. Holo is this hosting framework designed to let mainstream web users have full access to the kinds of P2P apps that are built in Holochain, but they're not a peer. They're not running a full peer. They're not serving themselves in the way Holochain peers are. So it's actually designed to be able to take Holochain apps mainstream to web users, but because they're not carrying their share of the load, others have to take that up for them. And that's where HoloFuel comes in to pay sort of a peer hosting network to be able to carry this additional load of peers that are not hosting themselves. And HoloFuel is the microtransaction accounting-based currency for serving that purpose, for doing a high volume of daily tiny hosting transactions. So that's one of the pieces that we need to take Holochain mainstream. And so it's special for us strategically, but it isn't special in terms of having any other kind of status versus other kinds of currencies people would make on Holochain. And there's some really great projects out there that are steps in this direction. My favorite is actually Holo REA, which is REA accounting built on Holochain, which kind of has the potential to turn any unit of account into a type of cryptocurrency, a type of crypto accounting based currency.
Mary, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate this because this is one of the things that comes up the most in terms of the confusion. And it's the first thing Arthur said. Holochain does not have a built-in token. Holochain doesn't have a token. It's not like blockchain that has built-in tokens. Holochain doesn't. Holo has a currency. And we could just keep saying that over and over, I think, because as anybody new that comes into the community, it is fundamentally the most confusing thing. Maybe we should tweet it, once a day.
Yep. Thanks very much, guys. Yeah. Well, maybe once every few hours. I think will help with some resources for people. It definitely takes a while to people get their head around it. Once people do, then it becomes pretty exciting. So a question about getting up to speed on Rust. So what were the resources that the Holochain team used to get up to speed on Rust? I'm a full stack developer, but brand new to Rust. Do you have any recommendations about how to approach it? As documentation is quite sparse.
So I'll take this one. We got a bunch of questions that are technical, and it's not that I'm going to answer all the specifics of the technical, but I did go out to our dev teams and pose the questions to them. So over the course of this AMA, we have dev speakers, and they just have my voice today. So Tom shared a couple of resources, and if you guys could go ahead and put the links out there, that would be great. He said Rust book, what streams, small challenges, and ask questions. And these are each links to places that you can learn about Rust, is what I understand. And he said, really, most devs are just friendly and helpful, most Rust devs. So if you like, you just want to, there's some Nanu tutorials, but just ask questions and start building something, really anything, he says. David M says this, strong coffee and make space for time to engage in spirited debate with the compiler. That's a fun one. He also says a lot of the resources tell you what you can do, but not what you can't. And that there's a huge amount of knowledge embedded in the compiler that's just not documented well, but it's readily available when you run into it. So,
yeah, if I could just say something on the heels of that. Rust's compiler gives far better errors than most compilers. Like, it generally is telling you a lot about what the problem is, and may even tell you a little bit about what it's expecting and how to fix it, and that kind of thing. And so it's worth experimenting. It's a very informative compiler, but as David's saying, a lot of times the challenge is just getting the code to compile. If you're doing something complex, like just representing it in a way that will meet all of Rust's strict requirements for managing the lifetimes of data and memory and that kind of memory usage, that kind of stuff. And part of the thing that we've been saying to ourselves is it's worth this extra time wrestling with getting things to compile, because Rust's strictness helps prevent you from introducing problems or making mistakes with memory management or memory leaks or reentrant code or things changing that shouldn't have changed while somebody else was using them and that kind of stuff. Rust is very strict about all that kind of stuff. And so especially for running a distributed system that has lots of different people could be stepping in, running things at different times, it's really important that we get this stuff right. And so we've been leaning on the strictness of the Rust compiler to make sure that we don't make some of the kinds of mistakes that are, famous for having introduced bugs like the big DAO, thing that caused the Ethereum hard fork and things like that, with reentrant code issues and stuff like that. So it's worth learning to wrestle with the Rust compiler. I say that having done only a small portion of Rust coding. I'm not one of the main Rust coders here.
All right. Thanks, guys. Okay, so on to the next question. There used to be a lot of talk about distributed energy in the past. Is there any news on that front? What are people doing right now, and will they still build on Holochain? You know,
yeah, so
well.
Yeah, so redgrid.io in Australia is one energy network that has fully committed to building on Holochain. They coordinate pretty closely with us, and they even hired one of our Australian team members after he took a leave in January and then resurfaced ready to work again. And there's a few other companies that have been exploring it. Maybe David, you could talk about some of those. But part of the key here is that Holochain is actually light enough to run on these kind of end user smart grid devices, and then be able to provide this immutable cryptographically signed data to keep the network honest. Essentially, you can even have countersigning of interactions of energy trading between nodes and things like that. And it's hard to get that kind of thing, and it's hard to build that kind of infrastructure, and that's what we've built in Holochain.
Yeah, no, we've got a paper coming out on that sometime in May, and there are a few other parties that we're talking to. So I think we'll just keep moving the questions on and cover a bit of breadth here. So a question about a HoloFuel transaction. When Alice is receiving a HoloFuel transaction from Bob, her node has to check his entire transaction history to make sure he legitimately has the necessary funds, right? So will the HoloFuel app check the entire history every time, or are there optimizations built in? For example, Alice's node could only check Bob's history until she comes across the last transaction between the two. So Mary and Art, Mary, you want to take this?
Well, I'll start it. This is a great question. Understanding how HoloFuel works, I think, is critical. The validation that's happening on HoloFuel is really about the source chain, and it doesn't check the entire history every time. If you think about it, that sort of design would just degrade over time, because you would just keep adding transactions and everybody's chains would get longer and longer. But it's not just looking for the last transaction between those two parties either. That would be a little odd. It's looking at the last transaction on the counterparty's chain, regardless of who that was with. And really what you need to think about are two things: is that counterparty, is their source chain valid? That is, has it been tampered with in any way? And what is that person's balance? Do you want to go into some of the details about how that's accomplished, Arthur?
Sure. In the question above, Alice and Bob, right? Alice's node does need to validate Bob's chain, and yeah, you can say if she's validated it before, maybe she could just go back to the last transaction that she did with Bob. But generally speaking, the validation process is fast enough that it's worth making sure when you're doing a transaction, because this is a moment at which you could potentially be party to fraud, right? Because remember, our transactions are doubly signed by both the spender and the receiver. So even if you're receiving the funds, it's your job to audit the other counterparty, because you're going to sign this transaction. So you want to be crystal clear there's no funny business going on. Now, the auditing their chain essentially is like fast forwarding through it, doing the math of doing the adds and adding and subtracting based on whether somebody was spending or receiving funds, and also checking the signatures of the counterparties and making sure that all those counterparties have not been blacklisted, or a warrant hasn't come out on them. And if a warrant has come out on them, that it was after any transaction that was party to in this chain. So there's a few types of things, but that's actually not all that much. Doing the math super fast, checking signatures. We use elliptical curve signatures that most CPUs nowadays can do about 20,000 signature verifications per second. So then this comes down to checking to see if any of the users are warranted, and you've got your own warrant list locally. So that's just a local check to see, are these people on my warrant list? And then, only then, if somebody is on the warrant list, then you might have to do a network lookup to see, when that warrant actually happened relative to the transaction on this chain. So that's a pretty fast process that only has a couple of delays if you've actually had some fraudulent parties in the mix in the transactions, where you'd actually have to do a network call and look up something. So it's pretty lightweight, and it's worth doing at the time you're doing a transaction. Now, let me just say one other thing about the countersigning of the transactions. That's really important to the security model of Holochain, because what it means is you can't create a Sybil account that's going to generate a bad transaction to send yourself money, for example, because you have to sign as the receiver of that transaction. And when that transaction gets identified as invalid because the Sybil didn't have the funds, right, now you are party to the fraud. And so what that means is we don't have to, like Mary was saying, we don't have to sort of like crawl all of the dependent forking history of where the funds came from. We only have to crawl the one person's chain, because if any party was partaking in fraud, even on the receiving side, then they get flagged, and that carries forward. It's sort of this transitive property of the warranting system, the immune system in HoloFuel. So one other thing is that the next version of HoloFuel that we're working on does have a performance optimization, and in some ways it's more for the UI but it could be also used as an optimization for validation, where we're carrying forward balance information in the transactions themselves. And so that means as from a UI perspective, you just have to look at the latest transaction and you can display the balance instead of having to actually go through the history and add up the chain. So that's an optimization there. But it could also mean, since Holochain is designed to be this micro transaction thing, and they may be low risk transactions, that maybe we only have the network peer validators validate the whole chain maybe every 5 transactions or something, and they can otherwise just be validating the change since the last transaction, which would significantly decrease the load and allow things to be sped up. And we're going to experiment with the assurance levels that gets us. But there are some things that we can do to optimize performance, and we're experimenting with that.
Super, thank you, Art. Okay, next one. So for a decentralized communication system like Holo, I don't understand how you're handling the DNS or domain name system sort of services. How will web users find apps? How do apps resolve the address of backend services, Art?
So first, for people, just to clarify what DNS is. DNS is the translation of a name, a human readable name, like, google.com or whatever, to an address that is going to actually route your information to, because all network packets are routed by address, not by name. So you have to be able to translate to an address. And in Holochain, or in Holo hosting rather, there's two layers in which we use DNS. One is the typical public DNS. And the public DNS is provided by Cloudflare, who is consistently measured as the fastest DNS service on the internet. Typically can resolve DNS queries in 10 or 11 milliseconds. There's actually some DNS performance sites out there. If you want to go check this, they always come out on top. So they provide secure encrypted DNS by default. They don't keep their logs past 24 hours. So there's that sort of additional privacy concerns here. And we use their JavaScript service workers to translate an app domain name to a random handful of hosts, to a set of hosts, essentially, host IDs. And so that runs in their 190 plus data centers spread across thousands of servers, so that even our sort of centralized parts of the Holo hosting framework in terms of DNS are more centralized than most blockchains, supernodes, or block producers, and that kind of stuff, right? It's already running across thousands of servers and very fast. However, there's a second layer of DNS that most people don't know is in play, which basically translates a host ID to their current VPN endpoint address. So we're using zero-tier VPN for being able to route traffic to peers that may, for example, be running behind NATs or firewalls, and we have to have a way of reaching them. And this second layer of translation is what we call our Holo router system, our Holo router layer. And at the moment, we're the only one running Holo router nodes, because this is still kind of in testing and logging and supervision while we're tracking all this. But it's actually set up to be able to have hosts that have public-facing IPs. One of the things is you have to have a public address to run a Holo router node. And then the hosts actually update, they re-register their addresses on a periodic basis so that we can actually route it to the correct IP address. So the two layers are domain name to host ID to IP address. And the two layers that requires two layers of translation going on. So I hope that explains how we're doing the translation.
Thanks, Art. This also reminds me of a couple of like the long-standing community members were a little bit skeptical when they first heard about Holochain, and the sort of filing a dossier of your responses to their Mattermost questions or forum questions, as well as other members of the team, and sort of ended up with a 40-page document of all of the responses as they were trying to build a detailed understanding of what we're doing. So it's definitely appreciated by people. So onto another question. So the immune self-healing system will surely require lots of monitoring and republishing of data whenever the redundancy level goes below the required level. How do you ensure a balance of data availability or resilience while still being resource efficient and high performant?
So Holochain's data integrity layer kind of has these two dynamics to it, these two patterns we call fast push and slow heal. The fast push is for establishing the initial data integrity, trying to get that time of eventual consistency down as short as possible. And what you're asking about here in this sort of the self-healing system is what we call the slow heal pattern. And that is about maintaining a healthy distribution of data throughout the network. And that's managed through peer gossip. So neighboring peers periodically update each other with new data. And I say periodically, we'll come back to that. When they connect with each other, they actually keep track of the statistics on how often they are able to reach their neighbor when they try to gossip or not. So this allows them to build average uptime estimates of the nodes in their neighborhood so that they know the health of the data that is happening in their neighborhood. We have validation receipts from which nodes are holding this. And then they can see, okay, I've got these 20 validation receipts, but I've got 25% uptime in this neighborhood. And I want to have, a target of 10 copies of this data live. And so that's essentially giving me 5 online copies at any time. So I need to recruit more nodes and to expand my gossip boundary to get more nodes into the network. And so into holding this data. And so that's a part of the kind of self-governing dynamic. It's a combination of who has validated they're holding it, and then what their uptime is when you're chatting with them. You're computing your own uptime data from your attempts to talk with them. How this becomes efficient is part of this is in our simple representation. We have a way of being able to represent based on your address, translated to 32 bits, plus a 32-bit integer of how far out from your address you're holding data. So just in 64 bits, we know exactly what data you're accountable to be holding, right? And that allows us to have a model of the data universe that's very efficient. And then in terms of the gossip, we also have basically exponential backoffs type things happening, where if there's frequent changes happening, then the gossip is more frequent. And if the activity levels are slower, then they can back off and let apps that have higher activity be doing more of the gossip. And so that it doesn't have to create too heavy a burden on your system and still can be efficient for when there's lots of changes happening. It occurs to me, not everybody knows what gossip is, and I didn't define that at the beginning. And let me just say that gossip is called what it is because it's modeled sort of on the human phenomenon of when you run into somebody and you say, "What's new since the last time I saw you?" You know, and that's essentially what these nodes are doing with each other. They're saying, "What's new? What new data have you seen since the last time we talked?" And then it allows them to keep each other up to date on changes that are happening in their neighborhood.
Well, thanks, Art. So, Mary, are there any shout outs in our dev team right now? Anyone doing some really amazing stuff?
I love this. Thank you for whoever contributed this one. Love getting it, love talking about it. But I also put this question out to the devs themselves to see what they had to say about each other. So I got a couple of those. David M said, he gave a shout out to everything related to stabilizing holofuel and simplification of the protocol that makes it easier to formally represent the Rust type system directly and more scalable and secure. What he's talking about there is some of the recent work we've been doing to refactor Holochain. As we've been sharing, the testing has allowed us, that we've been doing on the HoloPorts, has really allowed us to get a lot of direct feedback that we couldn't get directly from just running on test harnesses. And there's just been a ton of work that on that, some of which we're seeing in the immediate releases and the fixes that we're doing and pushing out again. And other of that is coming back and influencing larger work efforts in Holochain that are more transformative. So it's really exciting. I'd like to add that our newest contributors on the team are working in DevOps and Holo Central, Marek and Alexei, and they're doing great work. They were two of the folks that helped get Hydra rebuilt recently, if you guys heard about that. So that was kind of great. And I know it's not exactly on our team, but sometimes it feels like it is. We just have amazing, community contributors. And I just really wanted to appreciate Guillaume in particular. He's from Barcelona, and he's not the only one out there by a long shot, but he's been a huge part of getting the HWiki Holochain app built. And we've recently been sharing a lot about that. I think Arthur was talking about it here. And also he's been working on the Holochain playground, which is pretty awesome. And then David Meister, he answered this question, but I wanted to also do a shout out about him. David's awesome. He has been working extensively on some of Holochain's refactor work that I shared about. And in particular, he's one of the people who's been working on the changes to WASM. And so we expect to have these changes by themselves really catapult the speed and efficiency of Holochain. So it's really exciting work. Zippy had a couple of shout outs. Arthur, do you want to take those and speak a little bit more?
Sure. Let me just also mention the WASM changes should also significantly reduce RAM usage, making nanos more feasible for hosting than they are on the current version because the WebAssembly packages are so large at the moment. So Zippy was contributing. Zippy is Eric Harris Brown, by the way, for those of you that don't know, that's his username. Michael Daugherty has been contributing tons to making the impossible impossible, like really leveraging Rust compiler and type system and traits and things like that to really enforce the correctness of the coding on Holochain. That's one of the things that in working a bit on the refactored state model of Holochain, we've been emphasizing correctness. What else? David Braden, who's been tackling the complexities of async so that we actually are writing on the Tokyo library and having things really be efficiently called for asynchronous code to get rid of bottlenecks in the processing and increasing performance. Also I want to give a shout out to Philip in Australia, who's been working on a really kind of sexy set of experimental tools for generating Holochain apps and UIs and tests, and being able to kind of mash app code together that in a way that could actually make it feasible for kind of power users to assemble their own variants of existing Holochain apps without really needing to be coders. And I think that's going to allow some fun experimentation to emerge in the ecosystem. And one of the things about that is I hope it also makes it just more accessible in general. Like building crypto apps can seem very intimidating because they're like, in many cases, are written in stone and involve currencies and all that kind of stuff. And if we can provide these kind of experimental places to play, then I think that that's a really powerful thing for inviting new people in to play.
Cool. Just I'd like to add one thing, because this not quite this question, but something came up along these lines on a call last week, and obviously I get a lot of the communications around what we are, what we aren't doing, delays, etc. And I spend a lot of time with people and their frustration. And I was trying to, and I think like one of the things, I'm not sure what picture people have in their minds. You know, and as Art mentioned earlier, when we're talking about, you know, getting people to understand the difference between Holochain and a blockchain, the difference between holofuel and currencies. And I know no one knows where I'm quite going with this, so I'm enjoying seeing Art and Mary's faces as well, saying right at the end of the AMA, where's David going? But just stick with me for a second. So we have this, we have a base level of a really deep series of explanations and insights and mindset shifts as people get into this world, right? And I really encourage any of you who are sticking on this call to make another mindset shift, right? If we think of Eric Harris-Braun, the last 2 years, he's spent pretty much 7 days a week, 12+ hours coding Holochain, right? So firstly, a massive shout out to him building the team and all the devs on that team. But for you guys who are sitting there trying to conceive of what's happening, where the Lamborghinis are or whatever else you've got in your minds, just keep that image, right? This is what has been happening for the last 2 years. This is what will continue to happen as we get to beta and beyond. I think it's really, really, really important for people to hold when they're thinking about what we're doing here. And if you have any ideas, you're watching now, you have any ideas of how we can communicate that more effectively, please jump in the chat and tell us, because I would like to get it to a place with all of you where we're not spending time justifying or explaining what we're doing from the mindset you're applying to other projects or whatever else is going on, but you're actually coming to us with a base understanding of the efforts that have been put in over the last 2 years and will continue to put in as we get to beta and beyond. All right, so I'd like to finish with that one. All right, so just anything anyone wants to add?
Well, I think we're over time already.
Yeah, I think we've got a few great questions for the next AMA stacked up here. Just a reminder, if you'd like to be part of either the events that are coming up that I mentioned at the start, so some of the various online meetups, please join those events, holo.host/events. And if you're really excited after what you've heard today to join some of the community events, the forum.holochain.org/events to join the virtual hackalong and other places. And Mary's also already referenced Guillaume and other members of the community who are such a treasured and instrumental part and influential now part of what we're building. So please, for all of you, get involved. All right. Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Art. Fantastic.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great month.